I think in my lifetime there have been two great points of illumination that have been sparked by the genius of modern science that will have shifted the paradigm for all times. One of them, of course, we all remember from Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged for the first time in human history to see not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And that single moment of awareness, suddenly the planet was not seen as an infinite horizon, but a blue planet, as astronauts famously said, floating in the velvet void of space. And after that, everything changed. I remember once I was on Everest, and a climber said to me, the most amazing thing about climbing Mount Everest was the fact that you could strap on your boots in the morning, under your own locomotion, walk to a place where the air was so thin that human life was not possible. And he said, if that doesn't tell us something about the thin veil that surrounds the planet, nothing will. Well, of course, that's an idea that would never have occurred to George Mallory in 1921, or to Eric Shipton in 1933, or Sir Edmund Hillary when he first summited Everest in 1953. The second point of illumination also came about as a result of a long journey, an infinite journey, but not into space, but into the very fiber of our beings. And that is the fact that over the last generation, biologists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth. Race is an utter fiction. Indeed, we're all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of the Rift Valley some 65,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary hijira, a diaspora 40,000 years in the making, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But critically, if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, you have to accept the corollary, and that is the fact that every human culture, by definition, shares the same raw genius, the same mental acuity, the same human potential. And whether that genius is invested into technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or placed by contrast into the challenge of unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no progression in the affairs of culture. There is no ladder of success that goes from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London. That old Victorian idea that there was sort of a pyramid of advancement that plopped the Victorians at the apex and slipped down the sides to the so-called primitives of the world has been thoroughly discredited by modern science and shown to be as much an artifact of the 19th century as the notion that clergymen had then that the earth was only 6,000 years old. And so in this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, modern science has proven the interconnectedness of humanity. And what this fundamentally means is that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. They're not failed attempts at keeping up. On the contrary, every culture is by definition a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the myriad of cultures of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. So that revelation puts into even more haunting profile the darkest statistic of our era. And that is the fact that of the 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, today fully half aren't being taught to children. Now, a language is not just grammar or vocabulary. A language is a flash to the human spirit. A language is a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes in the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And there are many people who say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my answer to that is always to say, what a marvelous idea. But let's make that universal language a Nuptatak. Let's make it Tibetan. Let's make it Quechua, Haida, Lakota. And suddenly you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. Yet that dreadful plight is indeed the fate of somebody somewhere on earth, roughly every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder passes away and carries with them into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. But the question is, what can we do about it? When biologists, for example, identify an area of high species endemism, they can create a protected area. But as Rebecca well knows, you can't make a protected area of culture. You can't freeze people in time. You can't reduce a tribal society to some kind of zoological specimen for your own enchantment. And when we began at the National Geographic 12 years ago to address this issue, and I was recruited as an explorer in residence with a rather audacious mission of trying to change the way the world views and values culture in a decade, it was rather a daunting challenge. We knew that politicians never lead, that polemics are never persuasive, but we did know that storytellers change the world. And so I embarked on a series of journeys to the ethnosphere, and I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and beliefs and ideas and intuitions, myths and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere, of course, is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly imaginative species. So I embarked on a series of journeys into the ethnosphere to take our enormous audience of 300 million people in 165 countries and 37 languages, 2 points in the ethnosphere where the cultural beliefs would just be so dazzling they couldn't help but have a shift of awareness. Take, for example, the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon the southern sea. I was fortunate some years ago to be invited by the Polynesian Voyaging Society to set sail in the Hokulea, named after the sacred star of Hawaii, on a journey throughout the Pacific. Now, these are sailors who even today can name 300 stars in the night sky. These are sailors who can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern and can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who, in the hull of the vessel, can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the sacred canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. But the most amazing thing about this tradition, it was based on dead reckoning. Dead reckoning means you only know where you are by remembering how you got there. It was the impossibility of using that technique on a transoceanic voyage that kept Europeans hugging the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesian set sail into the rising sun. Within 1,000 years, they reached from New Guinea, an ancient civilization called Lapita. They reached Samoa and Tonga. Then they stopped for 1,000 years, and then they sailed on. 4,000 kilometers across the Central Pacific, reaching the Marquesas, northwest to Hawaii, southeast to Rapa Nui, eventually, at the time of the First Crusade, to what we now call New Zealand. But the wonderful metaphor is that the ship doesn't move at all. It sits the axis mundi of the world, and the Wayfinder, monk-like on the stern of the vessel, pulls the islands out of the sea. In a non-written tradition, this implied that the Wayfinder over a multi-week journey had to remember in his head every shift of wind, every shift of speed, every change of direction and course. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere, we enter the heartland of the Amazon, and a people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimukos, people who believe that mythologically they came up the Milk River in the belly of the sacred serpent to be regurgitated on the various banks of the affluents of the northwest Amazon, are people who live so closely to the forest that cognitively they do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the rainforest. A people that we now know to be the descendants of the great ancient civilizations of the Amazon. A people who, unlike some of the more marginal groups in the Amazon, I say marginal only because of their geographical isolation, these people had structures that facilitated peace, not war, not the least of which was a marriage rule that you had to marry somebody who spoke a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you had 6 and 7 languages spoken. You never saw a child practicing a distinct tongue. They simply watched, listened, and one day began to speak. We now understand that the complex mythology of the people of the Anaconda is nothing more or less than a land management plan that dictates precisely how people in the millions could have lived in the upland forest of the Northwest Amazon. Now, in the early 1970s, I was part of the dream academic grant of the era, $250,000 from the US government to study a plant known as the divine leaf of immortality, coca, the notorious source of cocaine. And it was an extraordinary assignment that took me the length and breadth of South America, and I became fascinated by this notion of sacred geography. And again, I don't mean to invoke hippie ethnography. I mean, what does it actually mean for a people to believe that the earth is alive, resonant, responsive to their desires, and that they themselves have reciprocal obligations to that landscape? I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I practiced in the woods as a logger and I was taught in school. That made me profoundly different than my brothers amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw, who believed that those forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that would have to be embraced during the Hamet's initiation, such that the wisdom of the wild would come back to the community in the potlatch. Now, the issue isn't who's right and who's wrong. Was that forest cellulose and board feet? Was it the domain of the spirits? The interesting observation is how the belief system as a metaphor mediates the interface between the culture and the place with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint. People of the First Nations lived in those forests for thousands of years with a modest impact. My way of thinking about those forests tore them asunder in 3 generations. So in Peru, what does it mean to believe that the mountain that soars above your village is an Apu, a deity that will direct your destiny? How does that make a young child, like my godson in the community of Chinchero, different than my own children, raised in a world that taught them that a mountain was simply a pile of rock ready to be mined? Well, once in each year, a remarkable event happens in this stunningly beautiful valley, site of the summer palace of Topa Inca Yupanqui, the second of the great Inca rulers. There only were 3 Inca. They built 14,000 miles of road in less than a century. And once each year, the fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman, or actually a transvestite. He puts on the tahe of his sister or his mother, he becomes known as a wailaka, and he must lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. It starts off at 11,500 feet, you drop down 2,000 feet, and then you climb to 16,000 feet, only to cross 2 more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a very long day. The metaphor is that the people go into the mountain as individuals, but through sacrifice, and sacrifice is derived from the Latin word to make sacred. Through pure exhaustion, you emerge as a single fused community that once again, through ritual and gesture, has reaffirmed your place in the planet. Now, at the age of 48, I became the only outsider and the oldest man ever to run the movimiento, and I only got through this 24-hour ordeal by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the plant. But actually, what really got me through it is that I had baptized in this beautiful pan-Andean way dozens of godchildren over the years, 30 years of doing research in this community, and I had raised them all and taught them all and I'd educated them all. And when they all heard that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they came out to the race and they clung to me like limpets. They weren't about to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean in these fantastic events like the Coyariti, where once each year, tens of thousands of people throughout the southern Andes come into a sacred valley called the Sinicara. It's a perfect fusion of 500 years of Catholic faith with pre-Columbian ideas. The metaphors come from the Bible. You carry the cross through the stations, but always in the shadow of the most important Apu of the Inca, Ausangati. Tens of thousands of people gather. It's a ritual for which they've prepared all year. The crosses are carried up into the mountains and then critically, overnight, placed in the actual ice of the glacier to be empowered for the coming year. Now, incidentally, the penultimate event at this 3-day ritual is men ship blocks of ice to carry that ice back to the elders incapable of the pilgrimage. They have unilaterally decided to stop doing that because they see the recession of the glaciers and they think it's their fault. And this is something that we'll touch upon through all of these stories. For us, climate change is a technical problem, a political controversy. For these people who believe they are responsible for the fate of the world, it's a deeply psychological crisis because they are at fault. Now, if in the southern Andes you have this sort of syncretic fusion of the reality of Latin America, there is one place in South America where the pre-Columbian voice can still be heard unfettered, and that is in this incredible complex of people known as the Elder Brothers, the Wiwa, the Canquano, the Arawakos, and the Cois, descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia. In the wake of the conquest, they retreated into this isolated volcanic massif that soars to 20,000 feet above the plains of the Caribbean. And in the blood-stained continent, these people alone were never fully conquered by the Spanish. They remain ruled by a ritual priesthood, but the training for the priesthood is astonishing. The young acolytes are taken away from the families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, 2 9-year periods mimicking the 9 months of gestation in their mother's womb. Now they're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother. And for all that time, the universe exists only as an abstraction, as they're taught the values of their community. And when finally the initiation is over, they are led by the priest on a journey to the heart of the world, a pilgrimage wherein, at the age of 18, they see the world for the first time. Now, this was reported in the 1940s by a famous anthropologist, but he never witnessed a pilgrimage. And it was almost like a fable. It was almost too good to believe until a wonderful thing happened one day. This man walked into my office with the Colombian ambassador. His name is Danilo Villafaña. And he was chatting to me with this delegation of mamos, or priests, when I suddenly interrupted him and I said, "Danilo, I hate to be rude, but you look an awful lot like an old friend of mine." And I didn't put it in here. And I showed him a photograph of the man who turned out to be his father. And I said, "Danilo, you may not know this, but in 1974, I lived with your family for a year, and I carried you as a baby for months up and down the mountains on my back." His father had been killed by the paramilitaries, and so this incredible connection led Danilo to invite us to go and film one of these journeys to the heart of the world. And what we discovered is that today the boys don't spend 18 years in the darkness, but they do spend 18 years in the confines of the men's sacred circle, much of the time at night, learning the Baroque religiosity of their tradition, and then they do actually go on this pilgrimage. And every single ripple in the landscape resonates with mythological significance. Even the hats the men weave from sisal are a conscious attempt to echo the snowfields and the flanks of Saranqua, the goddess of the world. And the metaphor in this society is a loom. They say, "Upon this loom I weave my life." So as they move up and down the mountains, their journeys are said to be threads. And when they pray, their fingers move because they're weaving the entire time. And we got to the penultimate place when suddenly we discovered the FARC was about to kidnap us. And so we had this, you can't really have a dramatic rescue on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But we've been training the Wiwa in cinematography, so they just simply finished the film for us as we escaped and made our way back down to the flank of the mountains, where even though the sacred sites may be covered by skyscrapers, it doesn't stop the elder brother from doing the ritual gestures that they literally believe save the world. And it's humbling to think that 2 hours from Miami Beach, as we sit here today, the elder brothers are collectively praying for our well-being. They speak in full sentences and paragraphs of our need to change the way we operate on this planet. Now, I was speaking with someone last night, and I was given a remarkable assignment by my great professor in 1982. He always would summon you into his 4th floor eyrie at the Botanical Museum at Harvard. And this day he said to me very simply whether I'd be interested in going down to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies and securing the formula of a drug used to make zombies. Well, I naturally said yes. And 2 weeks later I was in Haiti thinking that it would be a lark. And of course it consumed 4 years of my life, because once in the African reality, something was made available to me that had eluded me in 4 years in the Amazon, and that was a window wide open to the mystic. You know, why is it that when we ask ourselves to name the great religions of the world, is an entire continent kept out? Why is it that we use the term voodoo as if it's a black magic cult, when in fact it's a fond word from Dahomey that just means spirit or God? Voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's a complex metaphysical worldview. It's simply the religion of West Africa. And like all great religions, it's based on a relationship between the living and the dead. The living give birth to the dead become the spirits in turn, in this quintessentially democratic faith, must serve the living. To serve the living, they must become manifest. To become manifest, they must respond to the power of the drums, to come back from beneath the great water, to displace the soul of the living, so that for that brief shining moment, human being and God become one and the same. That's why you see these theatrical gestures in Dahomey, a fetish cutting into the skin to show the power of your faith. Haitians used to say to me, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful though they may be, are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law. Again, as if they're failed attempts at being us, at keeping up. Nothing could be further from the truth. Change in technology is no threat to culture. Power is a threat to culture. In every case, these are not frail, delicate peoples. These are dynamic, living societies being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And I wrote a book about my voodoo experiences that was made into the worst Hollywood movie in history. And Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should drive to California, throw the book over the state line, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I disappeared in the rainforests of Borneo. I always wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. I wanted to live with nomadic peoples who could perhaps teach me about another way of being. And of course, we were all once nomads, wanderers on a pristine planet. It was only with the Neolithic that we succumbed to the cult of the seed. And nomadic societies are profoundly different. How do you measure wealth in a society in which there's no incentive to accumulate anything? Well, wealth in these communities is explicitly defined as the strength of social relations between people, because if they fray, everybody suffers. Sharing is an involuntary reflex. There's no word for thank you in the Penang language because everything is automatically given. I once gave a cigarette to a Penang woman and watched in my amazement as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And in these societies, non-written societies, in the same way that you can hear the voices of a character when you read a novel, they can hear the voices of the creatures of the forest. I'm convinced of that, such that the flight of a hornbill becomes a cursive script, like a vocabulary written on the wind. But sadly, by the time I got to Borneo in the late 80s, the sound of the forest were the sound of machinery, and within a single generation, their way of life been torn upside down, their forests destroyed, their rivers so burdened by silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea, where the Japanese freighters hung light on the horizon, ready to fill their holds with raw logs ripped from the heart of Borneo. In a single generation, a way of life morally inspired, inherently right, had been crushed along with the forest that gave it birth. Now, I mentioned our attitude toward landscape. And one of the important things to do is all cultures are famously culturally myopic, faithful to their own interpretation of reality. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbarous, one who babbles. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist, but the Aztec had the same notion in Nahuatl. And so we don't think of ourselves as a culture. We call ourselves the modern world, which means nothing. We are a culture, and we're not outside of history. And so to go to the opposite extreme of the way that we treat the earth. Remember when Descartes famously said that all existed that was mind and matter. In a single phrase, he eviscerated all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, metaphor that had given comfort to people. And as Saul Bellow said, science and time would make a house cleaning of belief. But when we go to the most parsimonious of continents, Australia, we know from studies of the Y chromosome that the Aboriginal people of Australia are the very first people to walk out of Africa. Within 5,000 years, they made it across all the way to the most parsimonious of continents, and then they went walking. And they established over 10,000 clan territories, all of which were linked by a single idea, and that was a dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a notion that the world exists in multi-dimensions at the same time, with everything unfolding in the moment. In not one of the 670 languages of Australia or dialects is there a word for past, present, or future, or a word for time. There's only the dreaming. And now when the British first arrived in Australia, they saw people who looked strange, who had a simple technology, but what really offended the British is that the Australian Aboriginal people had no interest in progress. And since progress was the ethos of 18th century and 19th century European society, a notion that would die, incidentally, in the mud and carnage of Flanders, when they looked at the Aboriginal people, they concluded, because they had no interest in improving upon their lot, that they weren't people at all. And in their inimitable way, they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether Aboriginal people were human beings or not. As recently as 1960s, a school book in Australia, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, listed the Aboriginal people as the interesting forms of wildlife in the continent. But what was missing was a failure of the British to understand the subtlety of the devotional philosophy that was the dreaming. The whole purpose in life in Australia was not to improve anything. To the contrary, it was to do the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to maintain the world just as it was at the time of its creation, as if all of Western thought had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keeping it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. So I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed that trajectory as a species, yes, we wouldn't put a man on the moon, but on the other hand, you wouldn't be having a conference here at Garrison devoted to climate change. And so these aren't people, as Jared Diamond would suggest, who are primitive because of environment. These are people who are not primitive at all. And instead of technological wizardry, they invented a network of connectivity, kin categories so complex that it took 100 years for anthropologists to begin to decipher the matrix of social life that allowed that civilization to flourish. Now, if industrialization and ideology play a part in the erosion of the ethnosphere, perhaps ideology is the most pernicious force of all. This is a photograph I took of a nun at Angkor Wat, who you can see has had her feet and hands severed from her body for the crime of pursuing her Buddhist faith during the era of Pol Pot. And you can't see this photograph, unfortunately, but this is the most astonishing thing I've ever encountered in 12 trips to Cambodia, a man my age, because our entire age corps was simply wiped out in the killing fields. He survived because his foot was blasted off by a bomb. And now if we go into Tibet, a place I've spent a great deal of time, we'll really see the power of ideology. When Mao Zedong, the Marxist materialist from Beijing, distilling in his mind and his fantasies and ideology invented by a German philosopher distilled in the reading room of the British Library. Mao Zedong, the man who was singularly responsible for the death of more of his own people than Hitler and Stalin combined in his lifetime. When Mao Zedong whispered into the ears of the 14th Dalai Lama that all religion was poison, His Holiness knew what to expect. And with the final conquest of Tibet in 1959, 6,000 structures and temples and shortens were blasted apart, 1.2 million people killed for their faith. And what was it about the Dharma that was so threatening to the European mindset of Mao Zedong? Well, this is a good friend of Garrison, Mathieu Ricard, a very close friend of mine. And I made a film with Mathieu in the Himalaya. And those of you who don't know him can see from this image that it was rather like traveling through Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. Mathieu's an amazing figure. His father was France's most illustrious rational philosopher. His mother was a famous painter. Her paintings, Jonathan tells me, have exhibited here. Mathieu himself grew up in a house in Paris of luminaries. If you can believe it, he learned piano from Stravinsky. He learned photography from Henri Cartier-Bresson, anthropology at the feet of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He himself was studying as a molecular biologist in the lab of a Nobel laureate at the Pasteur Institute when he realized there was no correlation between fame, wealth, and happiness. So he went back to the land he had always been happy and became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And with us on this journey to the heart, we wanted to celebrate the idea of a hero of Everest, but not the Western heroes who, as I alluded to earlier, climb into a zone of death where consciousness is obliterated, which for the Buddhists is about the stupidest thing you could ever do in a precious incarnation, but a real bodhisattva, someone who had transcended the realm of samsara and elected to remain behind to facilitate the liberation of all sentient beings. And with us on this journey was Sherab Barma, a traditional Amshi doctor, and we began at Shiwang Monastery, which clings like a swallow's nest to the flank of the Himalaya in Nepal, under the guidance of Trusig Rinpoche, head of the Nyingma tradition and a teacher of His Holiness, and Rinpoche passed away last year. Shiwang is the site of the Manirimdu ceremony, an 18-day festival that commemorates the transmission of the Dharma to Tibet by Guru Rinpoche. Here is Sherab in the cave where, as part of his 7 years of medical training, he spent 1 solid year in meditative retreat. And as we moved up into the mountains with Mathieu reciting the sutras, our goal was to encounter a woman that Sherab as a doctor was treating. She was a woman who 45 years before had escaped the arms of a dreadful suitor by crawling down a latrine and covered with human excrement turned up at the feet of the abbot of Tembuche Monastery. He cleaned her up, dispatched her across a 23,000-foot Nangpa pass to Tibet, where she became ordained as a Tibetan nun. Then she retraced her journey and went into lifelong retreat. And for 45 years, she had lived in a single cell in a nunnery in a space no bigger than from me to Rebecca Square. And because in all of that time, the light of the sun had never fallen on her face. And this photograph is a photograph I took of her the first time the sun had done that. In terms of reference of our culture, the woman that opened that door should have been a madwoman. Instead, the face that greeted us radiated loving compassion. And Mathieu turned to me, and Mathieu had famously said, Western science is too often a major response to minor needs. We spend all of our lifetimes trying to live to be 100 without losing our teeth. In Tibet, we pursue the Dharma. He said, your billboards in the West celebrate naked teenagers in underwear. Our billboards are money walls of prayers for the well-being of sentient creatures. And he said, this is proof of the efficacy of the Dharma. Remember what the Dharma is. All the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean all life is negation. He meant shit happens. The second of the Noble Truth is that the cause of suffering is ignorance. He didn't mean stupidity. He meant the cruel tendency of human beings to cling to the illusion of their own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And of course, the fourth and most consequential was a delineation of a specific contemplative practice that said if you follow this path, not only will you have a chance of illumination, you have 2,500 years of empirical observation of a science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism that says that such a transformation will indeed happen. So this was a moment when Mathieu said to me, you see, that's it. The proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism is precisely the serenity achieved by the practitioner. And later that night, we encountered a Lama who said to me, you know, we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. And so it is left to us to explain why we tolerate the wrath of China that continues to sweep like a holocaust across the flanks of this ancient kingdom that has given us so much. As we speak now, sacred temples are still being torn apart. The political repression is worse than it has been since the Cultural Revolution. Every nunnery, and this shot I took last fall in Lhasa, has cameras that document every activity by the acolytes, and this is the future of Tibet as envisioned by the Chinese. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves a question. What kind of world do we want to live in? A monochromatic world of monotony or polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead said before she died that her greatest fear was that as we drifted toward this blandly amorphous generic world, not only would the entire range of the human imagination be reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but we would wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there are other possibilities of life. Culture is not trivial. If there's one lesson of anthropology, it's that culture is not decorative. It's not feathers and bells. It's not prayers. It's not even rituals. Ultimately, what culture is, in every society, is a body of moral and ethical values that we place around the individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history sadly teaches us lies within every human being. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in a universe that has none, and indeed, as Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, and the individual, torn from the constraints of tradition, is cast adrift, perhaps by his own volition or her own volition, seeking a world of affluence that will always be elusive, ending up too often the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere but into a miasma of disaffection and alienation, you simply have to look at the points of chaos around the world. There's a photograph I took just a month ago in Rwanda, and here from the Genocide Museum, you see the consequence when culture simply collapses. Millions of people killed in an orgy of insanity. Fortunately, the nation-state has finally come to understand that indigenous people do not embarrass it, they enrich it if that state's prepared to accept diversity. I grew up in a Canada that had no place for the First Nations. Now it does. The Inuit people of the Arctic had no homeland, but now that they do. Nunavut, an area half the size of Western Europe, where 26,000 Inuit control their destiny. You know, when the British first arrived in the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong. One did more to honor the human race, and what the British failed to understand was there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in that harsh Arctic environment on a technology that was limited to what you could carve from bone, stone, and forge from the cold. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The runners of their sleds were originally made of fish, 3 Arctic char laid in a row and wrapped in a caribou hide. When the British mimicked the ways of the Inuit, they achieved great feats of exploration. When they failed to do so, they suffered terrible deaths. When the last of Lord Franklin's men were found frozen to death at Starvation Cove in the Adelaide Peninsula, the young sailors were dragging behind them a sled made of oak and iron in Manchester, England, that weighed 500 pounds. On top of it was a dory from his ship that weighed 300 pounds. Inside the dory were all the accoutrements of a naval officer's dinner service, including silver plate and a copy of the novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. This they somehow expected to drag through the taiga of Canada, hoping to bump into a Hudson Bay post and achieve liberation. Of course, they suffered a terrible death. The Inuit, by contrast, moved lightly on the earth. Whatever Greenpeace tells you, blood on ice in the Arctic is not a sign of death. It's an affirmation of life itself. This is a photograph I took when I was polar bear hunting with the Inuit 250 miles off the island of Igloolik. That night, the temperature dropped to minus 65 Celsius before the wind picked up. They simply made an igloo, we crawled into the furs, lit the oil lamps. And when I was narwhal hunting, when I say hunting, I wasn't doing the hunting, I was just hanging out. At the tip of Baffin Island, I recorded this marvelous story from Olayak and Martha from Arctic Bay. And during the 1950s, a dark period of Canadian history, we forced the Inuit in the settlements to establish our sovereignty in the north as Canadians. This man's grandfather categorically refused to go. And so the family, fearful for his life, took away all of his weapons, all of his tools, thinking that that would force him into the settlement. Did it? No. In the middle of an Arctic night with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped outside of the igloo, pulled down his caribou hide and sealskin trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces began to freeze, he shaped it in the form of an implement. And when it took final form, he put a spray of saliva along the leading edge, and when the instrument, a knife, forged by the cold from human waste, was finally formed, he used it to kill a dog. He skinned the dog with it, improvised the traces of a sled with the skin of the dead dog, improvised a sled with the ribcage of the dead dog, harnessed up an adjacent living dog, and then shit knife in belt, disappeared in the Arctic night. Now talk about getting by with nothing. Now, I'm not suggesting there's an assembly line in the Arctic making shit knives, but anyone who's lived there knows that a towel left out in evening becomes a shovel by morning. And it's a great symbol of the resilience of Inuit people throughout the circumpolar area, but that's a resilience that now is being challenged by something that you are here to discuss. It's so haunting to go to the Arctic. This is a photograph taken in the northernmost community in the world of Kanak, the only community still to use dogs exclusively. In their cultural wisdom, the elders realize that the use of dogs is in fact the cultural pivot. A great example that it's not about the traditional versus the modern, but the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. The goal isn't to freeze people in time, but to make sure that all peoples of the world can have benefits of the best of modernity without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And in this community, however, the ice has simply disappeared. It used to come in September and stay till July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. I flew from the Igloolik in a charter flight with a friend of mine from Igloolik who had done this journey with his dogs. And as we crossed from Ellesmere Island across the Cane Basin toward Kanak, he looked out the windows of the plane and rivers of tears flowed down his cheeks because the ice that had carried him but 10 years before to Greenland no longer existed. The ice is simply melting, and with it, a way of life. And when I wrote that book, The Wayfinders, and just to close, the editors put on a subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World, which of course forced me to answer that question in the book. And throughout the book, I did so implicitly, as I've done, I hope, throughout this talk. But in the end, I answered it with two words, climate change. Not to suggest that any of us go back to a pre-industrial past or that any society be kept from the genius of the contemporary modern world as we define it, but rather to suggest that the very existence of all these different ways of being, of thinking, the recognition that our way of being is just one way of being, the acknowledgement that every culture has something to contribute, that every culture deserves to have a place at the council of human wisdom and knowledge, just that revelation puts the lie to those who say we cannot change as we know we must change the fundamental way we inhabit this planet. That ultimately is a great lesson of anthropology, because we need the prayers and the beliefs of these young Tibetan monks, just as we need the hopes of this young Maasai boy I met on the Serengeti, because for all of us and for all time, the multiple voices of humanity are intricately connected to our collective and naked geography of hope. Thank you.